Again, thank you everyone for joining us to today's masterclass. We're going to kick it off and waste no time. Bill, Layne, can you give us a brief introduction of who you are, what we're going to be chatting about today, and then I'll share the screen and kick off our presentation.
Bill, feel free to go first.
Bill?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of exercise science at the University of South Florida, and I direct the Performance and Physique Enhancement Laboratory at my university. My research specializes in sports nutrition and physique enhancement, so I look at different types of dieting, resistance training, all centered around the focus of losing body fat and either maintaining muscle mass when dieting or building muscle mass if it's like in an off-season type of lifestyle.
Awesome. And then Layne?
So my name is Layne Norton. I have a PhD in nutritional sciences, a bachelor's in biochemistry, and I've been a physique coach, not just contest prep, but just, anybody who wants to improve their body composition has been my target audience for 15 years now. So I started my business in 2005. I didn't form my LLC until 2007. But I've been coaching people since about 5 to 10 years before everybody on Instagram was an online coach. So, and then I've been successful in academics. I've also been a physique competitor myself. I've done well in drug-free bodybuilding, earning a pro card there and winning a pro show. And I've also done well in powerlifting, having won nationals twice and got a silver medal at Worlds back in 2015. So I've got a little bit of what I would guess you call a synergism between academics, my own personal experience, and then coaching over 2,000 people over a 15-year period.
So we have two of the best in the industry to be talking to you guys about physique coaching, and today's presentation is going to come to you to provide you all the things that you need to know to learn how to become an expert PT that gets results. With our presentation today, Bill is going to take the lead. The goal is going to be to bring you the tools to help you get epic results, get a better understanding of, understanding scientific info and setting you apart from the competition so you can take your coaching business to the next level. So Bill, take the lead.
Actually, I'm going to ask Layne to get us started on this, and I'll do the resistance training aspect.
Gotcha. So we're going to kick off with talking about the current problem for PTs.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest problems out there right now, if you look at, if I'm a PT, personal trainer, or an online coach specifically, is this market is so incredibly saturated. I'm going to pull up some numbers here real quick.
And most of our listeners are, either aspiring PTs, practicing PTs, or even people who are just interested in taking all of that knowledge and applying it to their own health and wellness as well.
If you look at the market out there, in the U.S. alone, there's over 340,000 personal trainers and over 100,000 nutritionists. And in Australia, there's about 35,000 personal trainers. And honestly, when we talk about our target audience is everybody. Because there's not a single person on this planet who doesn't want to look better and feel better. But one of the biggest problems out there, if you think about the space, is there are personal training certifications and there are nutrition certifications. And in most cases, those two don't synergize. And especially they don't focus on online nutrition coaching centering around body composition. So you have your PT certifications, which focus on training, while nutrition certifications focus on nutrition, with very little crossover unless you're doing like a nutrition specific personal training certification, which I know Clean Health does have one. But a lot of times with some of these nutrition certifications, you get basically a bunch of extra information that you might not need. Like, for example, if somebody comes to you, like, it's great to learn about, some of these things, like, let's say, like some kind of metabolic disorder. But quite frankly, as an online coach or, PT, if somebody comes to you with a metabolic disorder, you should not be taking on that person. You should be referring them out to a specialist. So, quite frankly, you're getting a lot of ancillary information that you'll probably never use. Whereas, like, what you really need are, like, what are the meat and potatoes of how do I take somebody from where they are, help them lose fat, gain muscle, and by the way, if you do that, I mean, a lot of people, they don't want to appear vain, and so they say things like, well, I just want to improve my health. Listen, if you have more muscle and less body fat, for the most part, not talking about the extremes, but for the most part, you will get healthier by default. So I think one of the big gaps out there right now is you don't have anything that really synergizes these things, that really looks at them as how do we do these things together? You know, nutrition and exercise, king and queen, these things go together, right? So I'll give for MMA fans out there, it used to be you'd have people, they went to a kickboxing gym, and then they'd go to a wrestling gym, and then they'd go to a jiu-jitsu gym. And none of those things crossed over. And now the reason MMA has gotten so good is because you have people just going to MMA gyms where they do everything, they synergize it all together. And so that's what's currently missing in this space. And really when we talk about like standing out, that is a huge, huge thing. So to stand out, how do you stand out? Because this space is so crowded. It's so crowded. Well, a lot of people do it the wrong way, which is I'm going to claim some really crazy stuff and then cherry pick studies to make you think that I know what I'm talking about. And that gets them a following because they're saying such crazy stuff, but it's not sustainable. And these are the people that are in and out of the industry in a couple of years. And the average lifespan in this industry is 2 years. So how do you stand out? Well, one, you got to be really good at what you do. That's if you want to do it the right way. Really good at what you do. I never marketed my coaching services. I never had to because I was so good at what I did that just through sheer word of mouth, when I got a client and I got results for them, they sent me 5 more clients. So by the time I would even think about marketing, I was so full with clients. I'm not kidding when I say circa 2014, 2015, I referred out over 95% of every inquiry that came to me. So again, being really good at what you do. Well, how was I really good at what I did? Well, one, I did it myself. I coached others, and I had the educational background to help decipher evidence-based information. And that made a huge difference.
Exactly.
Now, there's also the market.
The results.
The results do speak for themselves. Now, again, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody around to hear it, that can be a problem. So, marketing does help. Standing out online does help. But guess what a great way to stand out online is? Getting clients talking about you and tagging you on social media and doing those things. It's so funny. I got so lucky in that I just did some of the things that now is established that you're supposed to do, like content and like encouraging clients to tag you and all those sorts of things. I just did that through, accident. And it worked out. Yeah. So, but now I get to share a lot of this stuff with you. Bill gets to share a lot of this stuff with you. And guys, we have an announcement at the end of this, which I think is going to be really exciting for you all. So please stick around because there is a huge announcement coming with, I believe, what is a solution to this problem, or a big solution to this problem. And I am going to tell you guys, if you don't know Bill Campbell, you are missing out on probably the best, if not one of the best, researchers for body composition specific recommendations, and especially when it comes to females. So Bill's lab tends to, they still work with males, but they really felt like there was a void for female specific body composition research. And so that's what they focus on. And I can tell you that I have been so impressed every time I speak with Bill, not just as a scientist, but as a human being. He's just a great person. And I've read I don't want to give away too much, but I've read everything behind these slides. and I think you guys are about to have your minds blown. So, with all that said,
without further ado, let's blow some minds, right?
Well,
Let's go, Bill. Kick it off for us.
Thank you for the very humbling introduction. And if there's nobody else doing what I'm doing, it's not very difficult to be at the top because there's just not many labs that focus on physique enhancement, and then even fewer that really focus on female physique enhancement. But regardless, I'll accept the accolades. So what I'm going to do is spend just a few minutes talking about the exercise aspect of optimizing one's physique. And there's two important considerations. Well, I'm going to start with resistance exercise, and then I'm going to do a brief overview of the role of cardio for fat loss as well. And I want to make sure that I'm clear on something. The data that I'm going to present is not only for competitive bodybuilders, bikini competitors, physique athletes. This is for people like my mom who wants to lose body fat if she wants to live an active lifestyle. The scientific principles are the same. It just so happens that competitive bodybuilders, they need to be, they take things to a further degree in their exercise and nutrition. The principles do not change. So just keep that in mind. You don't have to be a stage-ready competitor to benefit from the information that we're going to talk about tonight. So we're going to start with resistance exercise, and I'm going to approach this through the eyes of a coach working with a client. Your resistance training program, it's your heartbeat of your exercise programming. It's something that you'll be doing today, next week, 10 years from now. If you're trying to build your body or optimize your physique, you will be resistance training. That is the mode of exercise that changes your body. In fact, it's the only mode that changes your body shape. Cardio can make you a smaller version of yourself, but it will not sculpt your body. Resistance exercise is the only one. And as I'm talking about the different principles of resistance training, I'm going to ask Dr. Norton just to chime in on his experiences with the thousands of people that he's worked with, or just if he has a perspective that he wants to share. So Layne, you won't be interrupting me as you give, just as it comes to you, just tell us what you're thinking.
Yeah.
So
awesome.
Let's start with how are muscles even built? Well, there's basically two, and sometimes there's three mechanisms that you're often going to see in the scientific literature. The main driver of muscle hypertrophy is mechanical tension. And think of that as just the muscles being pulled, the force being generated against the bone, against the other fibers. That mechanical tension causes a chemical response, which ultimately results in an increase in muscle protein synthesis. We also have something called metabolic stress, which also seems to have this same type of signal. So this would be like a lack of oxygen during a resistance exercise set. As you start to build up lactate in the muscle, it's the metabolic stress that occurs during each set of resistance training. And then sometimes you're going to see a third mechanism that's referred to as muscle damage. Layne and I aren't as convinced that is a causative factor, or is it just something that happens? Yes, you do have damage when you resistance train, but we're not convinced. The evidence doesn't lead us to suggest that that's causing muscle hypertrophy, just that it is present along with muscle hypertrophy.
Yeah, I think
so. The evidence of muscle damage is not very convincing.
Yeah, I want to just jump in here real quick, Bill, because I think, one of the things I'll talk about in our next masterclass when I talk about like reading and interpreting research is a lot of people who don't understand the research process will really misinterpret things that are correlated with what they see, right? So somebody might see, wow, well, I got really sore when I resistance trained and I grew muscle, so that means soreness must cause muscle growth. And I'll tell people, well, go run a marathon. I promise you'll be sore, but I don't think that you'll probably have grown muscle. So again, not to say that there's no role for muscle soreness and muscle growth, but based on the current understanding of research, and Bill, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears to be more of a passive player in the muscle hypertrophy experience, insofar as, yes, if you do the sorts of training that causes muscle growth, which is progressive overload, mechanical tension, mechanical stress, there are times where you will be sore, but it is not the soreness itself that is a requisite for growth.
Yeah.
And this gets into kind of talking about dependent and independent variables and those sorts of things, but I'll save that for next time.
Yeah.
So as you're designing a resistance training program, the correct prism, the filter for this, it is a session by session and a body part by body part process. That is bodybuilding. And I'm going to contrast that with powerlifting and working with athletes of a particular sport. So, Maria, if you would forward the slide here for a second. So again, let's go back to, let me make that statement again, because I think it's important. If you're training for muscle hypertrophy, it is a workout by workout, body part by body part perspective. And what I mean by workout is every time you're stimulating the muscle in a given workout, you've just encouraged the body, you've imparted a stimulus on the body for muscle growth. Now, you're going to get very disappointed if you lift it on Tuesday and you expect to wake up Wednesday with bigger muscles. That's not how it's going to work. It is a slower process, session by session, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and I'll add to this, decade by decade. Again, slow process. I love Dr. Norton. One of the things he said recently, and something when I listened to one of his presentations, fat loss is slow, but it's like warp speed compared to building muscle. So building muscle is if there's anything that's ever been the long game, it's muscle hypertrophy. Keep that in mind. So what do I mean by body part focus? Well, what I mean is, if you want to build bigger biceps, train your biceps. That is how a bodybuilder approaches their training. A powerlifter doesn't approach their training on a body part by body part basis. What does a powerlifter focus on? Movements, squats, bench press, deadlifts. So they're very exercise focused. And then let's move to athletes. If you're training a football player, soccer player, baseball player, how do they approach their training? Well, they're focused not on body parts, not on getting stronger in exercises, but on movement patterns that mimic their sport. So they're trying to generate as much ground reaction forces from their lower body so that that force can be transferred through their body and into the opponent, into a projectile, whatever it is they're doing. So optimizing your physique has a specific filter through which you program your resistance training. Again, long game in view, and think of it as a body part by body part focus. Can you forward the slide? One more. So again, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but if you want to grow your shoulders, how do you do that? Well, newsflash, train your shoulders. If you want to get bigger glutes, how do you do that? Train your glutes. Quads, train your quads. And you know, it sounds silly, but I'm not going to grow my calves by training my neck. It is very specific to the stimulus applied to the muscle group. So what I'm going to do now is just lay out a very general and hopefully easy to remember system for programming resistance training workouts. I like to call it the LEAF system just because it's very simple, easy to remember, and it's load, so how much weight you're going to be lifting during each set, effort, sometimes we refer to that as intensity, the amount of lifting that you'll do for or that you'll prescribe for your clients. Amount can also be training volume. And then the last one is frequency, and we typically view that within a weekly basis of training. That's the normative approach when looking at training frequency. So let's start with load. And again, load is something that's just, I'm going to make it sound easy. It's just how much weight you lift. So as I'm introducing this, it automatically makes me think a lot of people try to overcomplicate programming. And that's why we have this warning sign here. You probably have seen this. You'll see people that will sell their services as programmers. They'll give you elaborate periodization schemes, deloads, overloading, very complicated terminology. And I'm here to tell you that I don't want to say that that's a scam. That is so much overkill, it's ridiculous. Now, again, I'm not a powerlifting programming specialist. Dr. Norton can talk to you about programming for powerlifting. But as it speaks to muscle hypertrophy training, the programming does not have to be difficult, and it does not have to be complex. Anybody telling you that it has to be that, the first question you ask is, what are you trying to sell me? And usually what you're going to see is a marketing approach that makes their system unique and very secretive. So what Dr. Norton and I are giving you tonight, it's all free. It's the principles that are laid out. And again, as Layne suggested earlier, there's almost 2 years of effort into what we're showing you tonight just on resistance training and cardio. A lot of evidence supporting this. So let's go on and we'll look at load. So again, what is load? Load is simply how much weight you're lifting during each set. And this table here delineates this into 4 different categories. You have high loads, which is heavy weights, moderate loads, which is what it sounds like, and then the other 2 on the lower end, we're going to delineate this into 2 categories, low load and very low load. And the reason we make this designation is because we're going to have to prioritize one of these later on, because one of these categories will not optimize or maximize your muscle hypertrophy response to resistance training. So one other thing I want to highlight here is the number of reps that you're able to complete. So if you cannot do any more than 6 repetitions, so 6 or less, we're going to call that a high load. Now for power lifters, they're very rarely going to get outside of a high load in their training. For muscle hypertrophy training, you may often get outside of a high load of training. In fact, we'll talk about the kind of a sweet spot, which is the moderate load. So this would be choosing a weight that allows you to do between approximately 7 and 14 repetitions. And then we have low loads. Typically that's 15 to 30 repetitions. And I would say in practice, more often that's about 15 to 20 repetitions. But based on the evidence, we increase that to between 15 and 30 repetitions. And then very low loads, I'm going to highlight this in a few minutes. That's a very light weight. That's a weight that allows you to do 35, 45, 50, 70 repetitions, 100 repetitions in one set. And believe it or not, we have research that has looked at very low loads. So let's move on. Here's an example of a split that we did in my research lab. So this was in a protein study in resistance trained females. These were aspiring female physique athletes. And what we did in this study was we divided them into 2 groups. It was actually a protein study. So we had high protein in one group, low protein in the other. And the resistance training programming was broken down into this system that you see here. A majority of the time, 60% of the time, we had them lifting in the moderate load range. So they were choosing weights that they could do more than 6 times, but less than 15 times. And I would say more specifically about 8 to 12 reps, 60% of the time. 20% of the time, we had them lift with heavy weights, and the other 20% of the time with very low loads, where they aim between 15 to 20 repetitions. And what we found in this study, even regardless of the protein intake, the females gained upwards of about 4.5 pounds or 2.2 kilograms of lean mass over an 8-week period. And the reason I highlight this is because this was the most muscle, the most lean mass that my lab has ever generated on average in our subjects. And this was the breakdown of the training in terms of load distribution. So again, a sweet spot for moderate loads, sometimes high, sometimes low. All right, let's move on. The next one, and here's where we have to consider, you can't have load without a consideration of effort. And I'm going to go ahead and say this now. All four of these are intertwined. They're synergistically related. So you can't just take each one of these and kind of put it on its own island. This simple leaf system, it's simple, but they do work together. So when we say effort, sometimes a lot of people will refer to this as intensity. How hard are you working? And essentially that's what this is. It's how much effort are you putting into each set. So this particular term or concept is on a set by set basis. So you choose your weights, and now you have to ask yourself, okay, how hard am I going to work? If you would forward.
I just want to jump in here a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, and a lot of people actually still don't even understand this, and as Bill's going to get to, there is an objective way to define intensity. It is not how much you are sweating. It is not your heart rate. It is not, ooh, that felt like a hard workout. There are some objective ways to determine if you are training with the requisite intensity to optimize muscle growth. And feelings, sweating, and heart rate are not any of those determinants.
And that leads us into, what are the objective criteria? And as a researcher, just like Layne said, we can't tell our subjects work hard, because working hard for one subject may be completely different than for another subject in our studies. So we have to have some objective standard where everybody's working with the same effort or the same intensity. And the way that we do this in the research labs is to define intensity as failure or training to failure. Now, it just so happens there's two different ways that this is typically defined. There is absolute failure and technical failure. But before I look at them, what is training to failure? It's simply taking whatever weight you have and you keep lifting that for repetition after repetition until you cannot complete another repetition. Once you get to that point, we know that you can't do more. You are physically unable to do another repetition. So that standardizes this term called effort, and it's standardized based on, some people will call it volitional fatigue, or just to the point where you cannot do another repetition. So the first one there is absolute failure. So the way that I like to describe this is using a bench press. A bench press taken to absolute failure is one where if you're lifting by yourself, you can do 10 reps, but you can't do 11. So you've just completed your 10th rep. Again, you're by yourself in this example. And now you try for the 11th rep, and you cannot get it. So guess what happens? Well, sadly, you end up dying of starvation on the bench because you're by yourself and you can't get the bar off of you. So that is absolute failure. You cannot physically perform another repetition. Another way to look at this is technical failure. Technical failure is when you are unable to perform another repetition with good form. So you can appreciate when you tried for that 11th rep on the bench press, your butt probably came off the bench. You're probably arching your back more. You're probably trying to do everything you can. Breathe more. Your leg might come off the floor. All of these infractions of sound form are being violated. So the concept of technical failure would suggest that you stop a set, or you're training to technical failure when you are unable to perform another repetition with good form. And that's the definition that we like to promote. And again, this is also evidence-based. We have research of this. One, it's safer. And as we're going to learn here in a few minutes, you don't have to go to absolute failure. You don't even have to go to technical failure on your sets. All right, let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, and I think if I could just
So the answer to
jump in for a second.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things I really like to point out, because as you said, Bill, you don't have to train to failure, which is a lot of people, like especially old school pro bodybuilders, will be like, well, that means that you're not actually using intensity. And the fact of the matter is that you have to realize, one, most people, if they're not advanced, drastically underestimate or overestimate how close to failure they really are during a set. So a recent study looked at intermediates and beginners and had them, like during a set, say, how far away from failure are you? And so they would estimate, and then the researchers would push them to actual failure. And they overestimated how close they were to failure on like a 10 rep set by about 5 reps. Meaning they got to rep 8 and said, "Oh, I've got like one more left," or something like that, for example. And then they got 6 more. So most people, the true utility of training to failure is it gives you an objective basis for what failure feels like. Rather than, if you've never had the experience of training to failure, it's very difficult to determine what that actually feels like, especially with beginners and intermediates. And so I always use the example of like the first time I squatted 500 pounds for 5 reps, the person spotting me said they thought they were going to have to grab me on the first rep. And every single rep was very slow. So, and all that brings up another good point, is that exercises are not created equal when it comes to failure. I could take leg extensions to failure all day and keep going. If I take a single set of squats to failure, I'm smoked for days, if not, full weeks. So keep in mind that these things do matter and are important when Bill continues through this and talks about why you don't have to train to failure.
So the answer, which we've just elaborated, no, you don't need to train to failure. What the research suggests, and let me just say, this is coming from somebody who used to train to failure. When I was young, I trained to failure on every single
Doesn't
work.
count if you don't
And
bleed, bro.
I got to the point, and I was bleeding. What?
Or throw up after your set, right? Is that a measure that old school bodybuilders used to go off of?
Yeah, well, and training to failure on a squat gets you there quickly. So here's what we need to do. The evidence suggests that you don't need to train to failure, but rather you need to be near failure. So I'm going to state this in terms of the stimulus. You get the same hypertrophic stimulus on the muscle if you stop 1, 2, even 3 repetitions shy of failure as you do when you train to absolute failure, to where you can't lift it anymore. So you get the same hypertrophic stimulus, but yet your recovery potential has been very compromised. The fatiguing aspect of training to failure gets very high. So when you're training for hypertrophy, there's no physiological need to train to failure to optimize the stimulus for muscle hypertrophy. And I would also suggest it's going to take you longer to recovery, and you're probably doing yourself a disservice over time if you choose to train to failure constantly. Now, I'm going to give an example where training to failure is fine occasionally. The other thing I want to mention is training to failure, it is no better, and technically it is no worse than training to non-failure for maximizing muscle hypertrophy adaptations. But it is worse, it does lower your power production, both acutely and long term. So if you are working with anybody who also is an athlete, or if they're like in power building where they also want to train as a power lifter, you are compromising their ability to generate power by training to failure consistently. So what do we suggest? The evidence suggests that you take your work sets to near failure. And typically this is 1 or 2 repetitions shy of failure. And I'll tell you, a lot of people see this and they're like, oh, that's easy. That is not. If you truly take your sets to 1 or 2 repetitions shy of failure, that is an intense workout. And the way that you can guarantee that that happens is do include some days, I call them test days. Maybe it's once a month, maybe it's every 8 weeks, where you do take your sets to failure. Now, again, we're not talking about squats or deadlifts. We're talking about more of the accessory movements. And what this does is it kind of gauges where your training to failure number is at for a given weight, so that then for the next few weeks, you have a barometer or you have a standard for how close you need to get so that you truly are training to near failure on those sets. And I also want to say with this doesn't count your warm-up sets. Your warm-up sets are warm-up sets. Get the muscle warm, but on your work sets is where each set should be taken to near failure. All right, let's go into the next aspect of a comprehensive resistance training program. And this one's probably the most controversial, at least right now. And this one has to do with training volume. And this is simply, well, how many exercises should I do? How many sets should I do? How many reps should I do, total reps? And again, this has practical implications on the length of your workouts. And it also will have an impact on how many days per week you'll train. And we'll talk about that next when we get to frequency. But volume is simply how much do I lift over the course of a week, a month, a year. Now, typically we look at this in a week-to-week basis. So let's go to the next slide. And what we suggest as you monitor your volume is to use something referred to as the set volume approach. And the reason that we like this so much is, 1, it's easy. 2, most bodybuilders use this anyway. And 3, and I would say the most importantly, it's validated in the scientific literature. We actually have studies that have tested this and that have validated its use. So again, if you're going to come across certain programmers who want to try to overcomplicate things, I would ask 2 questions. 1, is that approach validated in the scientific literature? And 2, does it seem too complicated for it to actually be practical? So I absolutely love simplicity and scientifically validated, which is what set volume is. And basically what this means is if I do, let's say I work my chest 3 days per week and I do 5 sets per workout. That's 5 sets Monday, 5 sets Wednesday, 5 sets Friday. That's 15 sets for my chest that are work sets, not counting my warm-up sets. That's my set volume for chest. So that week I did 15 sets. If I'm going to increase my volume, I know that I increase from 15 sets. If I decrease, I'm going to do less than 15 sets per week. So it's as long as you can add, this system is very easy to remember. And like I said, it's what most people use anyway, and we have multiple studies validating its use. On the next slide, I just want to show you some general categories for what would designate low versus moderate versus high volume. And remember, this is still a muscle group perspective. How many sets do you do for biceps? How many sets do you do for quads? How many sets are you doing for glutes? How many sets do you do for back? Everything is a body part focus. Now, I'm giving you an overview of this, and as Layne will mention later, we have a source where there's a lot more details, and I'm not going to get into it tonight, but what about those exercises that stimulate 2 muscle groups? Like a bench press is chest and triceps. Well, we recommend a system for dealing with that. But if you look at this figure here, if you're doing up to 9 sets per week on a body part, that's considered low volume. When you do between 10 and 20 sets per week on a body part, now that's considered moderate volume. And then 20 or more sets per week is considered high volume. And the nice thing about this is when you consider this in terms of a body part by body part perspective, you can take the approach, well, what do I need to work on? Well, for that particular muscle group, you emphasize that body part. if you have a strength, let's say for me, my strength is my quads. Well, maybe I don't put as much volume emphasis on my quads, but I really need to work more on my back. Well, then I'm going to, for some body parts, I'm going to go towards a high moderate. For some, I might go into the lower set volume approach. So you prioritize based on the body that you want to build with this. And I'll just give an example for myself. Right now, I have my body parts. I'm doing 10 sets per body part for all of my body parts. I'm just doing this kind of as a standard program for the next 8 weeks. And that would put me at the very low end of the moderate volume category. And if anybody's curious, for me, that's about 4 hours per week of training. I train about an hour a day, 4 days per week. And that's what gets me to 10 sets. So you do appreciate, if you're going to be in the high volume category, you are now doing Layne type marathon workouts. Likely you're going to have to put a lot more time in to reach that amount of volume. All right, let's go to the next slide. One more thing on volume. So before I get into frequency, which is my last concept, with volume, I started this by saying it's somewhat controversial, and there is a methodological flaw in most of the research, and just briefly, that flaw is almost all of the studies that look at volume have never considered the amount of volume that subjects were doing before they entered the study. So again, I don't want to get into that too much, but do know that there is a ubiquitous problem, methodological issue in much of this research. And I think going forward, science corrects itself, and that's what's going to happen with all of the future training volume studies. Now, just one quick note. It's kind of interesting. All of the studies that have looked at volume increases, there's only two outcomes. Either there is no improvement in muscle hypertrophy with increased training volume, or you get an increase in muscle hypertrophy. So you're never going to get a study where you have an increase in training volume and a decrease in lean mass. Those studies, you do not see those outcomes. The other general rationale that I and Layne, we kind of rely on, is you have many different laboratories coming to the same conclusions. This isn't coming from one lab. So you have, again, let's say there's 20 studies. Actually, there's approximately 30 studies on training volume. I'd say probably half of them, no difference in muscle hypertrophy. The other half, an increase in muscle hypertrophy. And then the interesting thing is that adds to my confidence that increasing volume leads to improved muscle hypertrophy outcomes is a variation of testing, or what they use to measure hypertrophy. So we have whole body measures like DEXA, BOD-POD, underwater weighing. We have MRI-based studies. We have CT studies. We also have muscle biopsy studies where they're looking at muscle fiber areas. And then we have ultrasound muscle thickness. So you have different labs all using different methods of assessment, all coming to pretty much the same conclusion. There's either an increase in muscle hypertrophy with increasing volume, or there's no change in muscle hypertrophy.
Bill,
Okay.
I was going to ask one follow-up question, because this is a term that, maybe coaches see, especially with social media. And like you said, this topic is a hot topic right now. And I'm not sure if you're going to cover this, but, the term junk volume, and it doesn't get to the point where too much volume can actually stunt progression of muscle growth. And you touched on it, that there has been no research to support that. But are you familiar with the term junk volume, and how do you avoid having that prescribed for your athletes and clients?
Yeah, so I love that question. And if you follow the system that we're outlining here, and if we go back to the effort, what was the principle that we laid out for effort? That principle was, if you take each working set to near failure, you've just eliminated any potential for junk volume to ever enter into your programming. Junk volume is where you're just doing set after set after set, but you're not necessarily training with enough intensity to generate a stimulus
Yeah.
for hypertrophy. So if you're doing this, if you're using effort the way that we have laid out the principles, it kind of eliminates junk volume. Now, the other thing to consider is if you need, let's say, 8 sets per week to maximize the muscle hypertrophic stimulus on a muscle group, you need 8, but you're doing 24. Well, there's a situation where, yes, that you could even if you're taking each set to near failure, what are you doing there? Well, you are tapping into your recovery ability, and you're probably generating excess fatigue that may not manifest itself today or tomorrow, but over time it could cause burnout, psychological distress, those types of things. But in terms of the junk volume, in terms of just doing set after set with very little effort, if you use the set volume approach that we're advocating, you eliminate that as even an option with introducing junk volume into your program. And just before you
go on, because there is a student follow-up question to that, if you don't have access to heavy enough weights, how do you avoid junk volume if you're doing more sets to make up for this?
So the answer to that is you take each of those sets to near failure or to failure if it's a very lightweight. So as long as you can even use light weights, and as long as you take those sets to failure or near failure, you will optimize, or you will generate muscle hypertrophy. The only caveat to that is if the weight or the load is so light that you're getting more than 30 repetitions per set. 2 studies have shown this. So if I'm choosing, let's just say bicep curls, if I'm choosing a weight that allows me to get 50 repetitions per set, I go to 50 reps and then I can't get another repetition with good form, I'm still going to have a stimulus that will promote muscle hypertrophy. But what I'm not doing is I'm not optimizing muscle hypertrophy. So will I grow muscle? Yes. Will I grow as much muscle as if I did a set with 12 repetitions? No. So you can still get progress, but if the weight is too light, you're not optimizing the hypertrophic response to that.
Thank you for answering that follow-up question. Our students are very grateful for you to be answering them as you're presenting. Let's go to frequency.
Yeah. So this is the last principle that we're laying out. Again, please appreciate what we're talking about tonight. This is a very general overview. There is hundreds of references behind these simple slides that got us to this. Again, over a year's worth of effort to make this system just seem so simple, but yet it's scientifically validated. So here we have, well, how often should I train each body part? We know we have a body part focus. We know that any load will work. We can choose heavy weights. We can choose light weights. We can choose moderate weights. It probably makes sense to, in terms of load, use a moderate load most of the time, because then you're getting the sweet spot of mechanical tension and metabolic stress. But if you have light weights, you can use light weights. Just make sure that you're going to near failure. And if you're getting more than 30 repetitions per set, you are leaving a little bit on the table in terms of maximally adapting to your hypertrophic stimulus there. So we end with, well, how often should I train a body part? And the nice thing here is we don't have a lot of data to base this on. So there's not a lot of absolutes. We do have one absolute that I'll share with you in a moment. But frequency is at this point in its infancy. So let's go to the next slide. There's going to be 2 considerations that are going to help you answer your own question. The one is, well, how much time do you have? Is it even, if you can't work out 6 days per week, don't even pretend that you would program a schedule where you're lifting 6 days per week. So what does your schedule allow you to do? That's a practical consideration, one that you should interpret, because that allows you to adhere to your training program. And then the second one is, if you're going to lift high volume, if you're going to be over 20 sets per week per body part, that's going to almost demand, or that will demand, that you're going to have a higher frequency of training to get that volume into your schedule. So the higher the volume, the more frequently you're going to have to train. And I make that point because earlier I said there's one absolute no that we don't do with frequency programming. So let's look to the next slide. The one absolute is that you do not do all of your training, all of your set volume, all of your body part training on one day. So if you go to the next slide, we have a few studies that have reported if you put all of your chest on one day or all of your quads on one day, that is inferior than when you split it over 2 or more days per week. So this is really the only absolute that we have based on the evidence. What we don't know is 2 days better than 4? Is 4 better than 3? Is 5 better than 2? We don't have enough data to say which one's best. The only thing we can say at this point with confidence is hit your body parts, stimulate your body parts more than once per week, and anything more than that is at this point, to the best of my knowledge, it's equally effective. So let your schedule dictate that. Again, think back to just some traditional bodybuilding programming, push-pull systems, upper-lower, push-pull leg, upper-lower body, all of those. The one thing that this is prohibiting is, I guess, the old bro-style workouts where you have chest day, shoulder day, arms day, back day. We do have evidence to say that that is not ideal. So the general principle here is identify your body parts and then attempt to stimulate that body part 2 or more times per week.
Yeah, I do want to jump in here real quick, Bill, because two things, and I want to be really careful because I think sometimes when people hear this, they say, well, that's not true. I trained everything 1 time per week, and I've gotten so much more muscular. So whenever we do these, we are basing our comparison off what is the most optimal thing to maximize muscle hypertrophy and or strength. We are not saying that you cannot gain muscle that way. We are simply saying it is probably not the ideal way to go about things. The next part is, right now we have, the evidence says, as Bill said, 2 times per week, better than 1 time per week. I think it was significant for upper body, but there was like a trend for lower body, that sort of thing. But there really isn't anything to say like 3 times per week, 4 times per week. And quite frankly, there may never be, because you need to understand that in order for like 3-4 times a week per body part, for that to actually be maybe requisite for optimal muscle mass, that's probably going to be in very advanced trainers, which are typically not the people who are included in research studies. And there's a really good reason for this. Advanced trainers, competitive bodybuilders, competitive powerlifters are horrible test subjects, because as soon as they get randomized to the group that they do not want to be in, they will drop out of the study, because scientific evidence is not more important than their own gains, because they are competitors. They don't want to be doing anything that they might think is suboptimal. So imagine, if you will, for a moment, if you think that volume is important and you get randomized to a low volume group, or you think frequency is important but you get randomized to the low frequency group, or you think protein is important and you get randomized to a low protein group, you are not going to stick out that study for 16 weeks and possibly miss out on gains. So it's really important when we talk, and I'll talk more about this in my lecture next masterclass, it's really important that we understand that just because a study has a limitation doesn't mean it's not valid. And it also doesn't mean it's the end-all be-all. So please keep that in mind.
And then, Bill, there was a question from one of our students before you move on from frequency about if enhanced athletes would be able to sustain a lot more volume, therefore having a smaller frequency.
So I'll speak to the evidence. We don't have any, I'm not aware of any research that looked at enhanced athletes and used the frequency debate as an independent variable. So the data that I'm using to rely on these principles is coming from a non-enhanced athlete. So I can appreciate an enhanced athlete probably has superior recovery abilities, so that may cause differences in what you can do in terms of volume, in terms of frequency, and we just don't have evidence to base that on. Layne, I don't know what your response to that would be.
Yeah, so I would completely agree with you. So I'm going to say echo what Bill just said. So we just don't have the evidence to make a strong statement. I will go ahead and speculate. So there are certain groups of people who like to think that they are unicorns. Women can often fall into this category. People over 40 fall into this category often. I always get this, okay, but I'm a female over 40. As no disrespect, but not as if there's not, hundreds of millions of people in that category. You're still a human being. Maybe there are some slight variations we need to make, based on your own personal experience and aches and pains, whatever. People on performance-enhancing drugs tend to think they're unicorns, and that the rules or these principles do not apply to them. And what I will say is the principles, all the scientific evidence we have, does not show that people on steroids respond any differently to resistance exercise, cardiovascular exercise, or nutrition, other than it simply increases the rate at which you accrue lean mass, and it seems to differentially partition nutrients towards lean mass and away from fat mass. Those are the only differences, but really what we're dealing with is not a difference in direction of results. We are just dealing with a difference in the rate of results. So this is where I go crazy when people are like, well, people on steroids, they need 500 grams of protein a day. And so my first response is, so you're saying that steroids, so if they need 500 grams of protein, you're saying that steroids are somehow catabolic. Because if they need that much more protein than the average person, why do they need that much more protein? And the response always is from a substrate perspective that, well, you're building so much lean mass that unless you have a bunch of protein, you won't be able to build all that lean mass. So if we look at what maximizes the rate of protein synthesis, it's about 1.6 to 2.4 grams per kilogram of body weight in terms of protein. And then we look at if you wanted to put on 25 kilograms of lean mass in a year, and that is an enormous amount of lean mass. Even for somebody on a boatload of steroids, that is an enormous amount of lean mass. I don't think there's anybody who would debate that has to be near the upper limit of what you can acquire lean mass-wise in a year, even on steroids. Do you know what that translates into in terms of grams of extra substrate you need per day over the course of that time to build that tissue, once you account for the fact that skeletal muscle is about 70% water? It's about 10 grams. You need about 10 grams extra protein per day as a performance-enhanced person. If that. I can tell you that's not a significant amount. So this idea that steroids just completely change the game and you just need to do things so differently because you're on steroids, there is no evidence to support that, and that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
I think we sufficiently answered that question, so thank you to the student that answered that.
All right, let's move on. Well, let me just summarize what we just looked at. So if you've got nothing else out of what we just talked about for the last 30 or 40 minutes, choose a weight that's moderately heavy most of the time. Take that weight to near failure on each set and stimulate each body part about twice per week, 2 or more times per week. If you do those things, you are maximizing, or you're an evidence-based trainer at that point, and 2, you're maximizing the adaptations that you can get from your programming. So just stripping this down to its most basic parts. Choose a weight that's moderately heavy. Lift that weight until you only have 1 or 2 reps left, and do that 2 or more times per week for each body part. That is a nutshell of what we just described. Not complicated. It might not even be sexy, but it's effective. All right, so now let's move on to, I'm not going to spend as much time on cardio for fat loss, but we have to appreciate that right now we're talking about fat loss. And I'm going to start with not telling you what to do, but I'm going to say, don't do this. And what this is don't use your resistance training as a stimulus for fat loss. There's a couple things that just are my pet peeves. One of them is when my kids leave the milk out. They put milk on their cereal, then they leave the milk out on the table. And I'm like, oh, now it's warm. The other thing that keeps me up at night is when people are using their resistance training workouts for fat loss. That is not the purpose of resistance training. Your goal in your life to build muscle is resistance training. Use that for that purpose. There's other tools for fat loss. So again, that's the one thing you should not do when thinking of fat loss. The primary tool for fat loss is a caloric deficit. That is the most impactful thing you can do to induce fat loss. Now, a supplement to a caloric deficit would be cardio exercise. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use cardio without a caloric deficit to induce fat loss. There may be times, and I think that's a valid justification. But you shouldn't look at, one, don't use resistance training for fat loss. Think of your energy balance, your caloric intake or your diet, a caloric deficit, as your primary tool, and then your cardio as a supplement to your diet or your caloric deficit to induce greater amounts of fat loss. All right, let's go on. So cardio will contribute to an overall energy deficit. So I kind of, I would never tell you, don't do cardio in the off season or if you're not in a fat loss phase. Cardiovascular or aerobic exercise is the best, the most heart healthy mode of exercise you can do. So by all means, to have a healthy life, do cardio. Now you don't have to do extreme volumes of cardio to get the cardiovascular benefits. But when I look at somebody's year-long training program and their physique journey, I'm seeing something that never changes, which is their resistance training program. Now, that will change with volume exercises, but they're going to always be resistance training. There's going to be times when they're in a caloric deficit, and there's going to be times when they're adding additional cardio to their program to induce greater amounts of fat loss. So I look at just resistance training as like this straight line, and then cardio and caloric deficits, and maybe even caloric surpluses if you're trying to build muscle. Those are the variables that are going to change as you're trying to build your ultimate body or trying to optimize your physique. Now, how much cardio should you be programming? Well, that depends on a host of factors. The primary one is how much body fat do you need to lose? How much time do you have if you have a significant event like a bodybuilding show, maybe a wedding date, or some type of other event? So the volume of your aerobic training is going to depend on your goals and the time frame for those goals. Another general principle here is if you're working with clients, I wouldn't tell a client you have to be running or you have to use the bike because that's what all the research uses. If your client loves like rollerblading, let them rollerblade. There's no evidence to suggest that one of these is more or less effective. The biggest thing is just the energy imbalance the energy deficit that you're creating from the aerobic exercise. So if a client has a preference, my advice would be just feed that beast. Let them do the mode of aerobic exercise that they prefer. All right, let's go to the next slide. Now I'm gonna present these as since resistance training is really never leaving your lifestyle, other than a period of a deload where you're taking maybe one or a few weeks off. So notwithstanding that, what are some considerations for programming cardio along with your resistance training program? So one thing would be, if possible, schedule your cardio on days that you don't have resistance training workouts. Now, again, that may not be possible, but if at all possible, do that. If you do have to have your cardio and resistance training in the same day, ideally separate them by at least 2 hours apart, or ideally, there's some evidence to suggest that 6 hours apart is the best distance from resistance training to an aerobic exercise workout. Now, again, let's appreciate not everybody's going to be able to do that. You may have to combine them. And to be honest, when I'm doing cardio for fat loss, I often combine them just because of the way that my day's structured with my work. So in those situations, the evidence would suggest when you do them back to back, do resistance exercise first, followed by your cardio exercise.
Bill, one follow-up question to that from our students. And, we hear this often as coaches, and you see it on social media all the time, coaches preaching fasted cardio. Where does that play in the effectiveness and the research that supports or denies that is more effective for fat loss? Yeah, so go forward one more slide, and I'll touch on that right now. So just some final considerations. Fasted cardio, if you look at the short-term data and you look at what's being oxidized, or that's a fancy word for what are you burning more of, it does appear that you're burning more fat when you're engaging in fasted cardio. But there's been approximately 5 studies that have instituted fasted cardio, and then they actually looked at fat loss. And remember, fat loss is different than fat oxidation or lipolysis. So you're burning fat now. Does that mean you're actually losing body fat? And the answer appears to be no. So fasted cardio doesn't appear, according to these 5 studies, that it doesn't appear to be a superior form of fat loss over the long term. So over 8 weeks of training. Does it cause any harm? No, I'm not aware of any harm. For myself, I actually like training in the fasted state. I do it just because it fits my lifestyle, not because I think I'm getting a metabolic advantage. Now, I know we're not talking about supplements tonight, but if you were to introduce caffeine or yohimbine into this equation, we don't have evidence of this, but I can make a pretty strong physiological argument that you would be burning more fat when you start introducing some of these nutrient partitioning agents. But fasted cardio, evidence suggests you're not burning more fat. You're not losing more fat over time, but there also appears to be no harm. Did you have another follow-up?
Yeah, so there was actually, I think, a study just released looking at yohimbine with fasting or without fasting, and they actually saw no differences in fat, like the loss of body fat. So this is something I'm going to highlight in our next masterclass when I'm talking about how to read research. Did they answer the question that you actually care about? People, what do you mean by that? Are they looking at a mechanism, or are they actually looking at a hard outcome? Fat oxidation is a mechanism. It is not the loss of body fat. Those are 2 different things, because the loss of body fat is basically determined by 2 things. Fat oxidation being one, and fat storage being the other. It is the balance between those 2 rates, because you are always storing fat and burning fat simultaneously. I honestly don't give a damn about my rates of fat oxidation. And I don't care about my rates of fat storage. What I care about is the loss of body fat, which is the hard outcome. There are plenty of studies to show that if you fast, you will get increased rates of fat oxidation. Or if you eat low carb, you'll get increased rates of fat oxidation. But when you pair it with the following words, human randomized control trial equating for calories and total work, there are literally zilch, no studies showing any difference in the actual loss of body fat, which, to be frank, is what I care about. And so once again, when you're looking at research studies, you have to be very careful, especially when people on social media claim something like, take a Paul Saladino, who now is, ranting about the size of children's taints. But before that, was doing a video on, I'm not kidding. I wish I was. Before that, was doing a video every week about, is this BS? And he'd pick a food. Is kale BS? Is Brussels sprouts BS? And he would find a nutrient in those plants that he would claim was toxic. And he would cite a study. And if you go into the study, it's almost always a study where it was in lab animals, and they give an isolated chemical compound that is present in these plants, but an isolated compound in a high dose, and they saw, oh wow, it was toxic. Well, no kidding. That is not the same thing as showing that what you are consuming is toxic. That is a very different story, and again, something I'm going to cover in the next masterclass. So, fat oxidation and fat loss are not the same thing. Fat oxidation is part of the process of fat loss, but it is not the same thing as fat loss.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, when you do have people touting fasted cardio, they are latching on to the fat oxidation argument.
Exactly.
All right, just a couple other considerations. The interference effect. If I add cardio to my resistance training program, am I limiting the amount of muscle mass? And I was concerned about this for years, but the evidence is it is overwhelmingly clear. There's more evidence supporting adding cardio will actually build muscle than it will to lose muscle, if you can believe that. And again, this is in DEXA studies, ultrasound studies, muscle fiber studies. So you don't have to be concerned that adding cardio is going to detract from your ability to maintain or build muscle mass. Now, admittedly, we don't have data in enhanced athletes. If somebody's carrying around an extra 80 pounds of lean mass and they're running a marathon on the weekend, yeah, I think they would probably lose muscle mass just from an energy deficit standpoint. So we don't have evidence in, that's why I have that note there, the lack of data in advanced trainees. That this next slide here, there's an entire book written on this concept, and they make a very strong argument that is just a folklore argument that adding cardio to your resistance training program, and again, it makes sense. You think, well, it's a different signaling mechanism. It's not anabolic, it's catabolic, but the evidence overwhelmingly just does not support that. So don't fear that adding cardio is going to hurt your ability to maintain your muscle mass, even when dieting. And then the other thing here is our original approach to this was fat loss. And I'll tell you, if you want a very powerful stimulus for fat loss, do cardio, do aerobic exercise. It is a powerful stimulus. It targets fat. When you combine it with a caloric deficit, it is a powerful stimulus that the body responds to by releasing, as Layne was saying, fat storage. It's powerful. So cardio, I think a lot of people fear that. Obviously, competitors. Well, Marie, I'll ask you: Do you? And again, you don't have to do cardio for fat loss. I'm not saying you have to. I'm just saying the evidence is clear. Do you rely on cardio to help you to get stage lean, or you don't?
Oh, I
use
definitely
cardio?
do. Especially, I did back-to-back shows, and by my third prep for my third show, that was my source, because in reality, I really didn't have much room to cut from calories anymore. And it got to a point where, realistically, I couldn't sustain that after show. And I was actually going to add a follow-up to that, where I think the confusion sometimes comes with muscle building and retention and cardio, where, when you're trying to build muscle, building muscle and losing body fat happen in two different stages, at least for physique athletes. I go through a muscle building phase, and then I go through a fat loss phase to get ready for show. During my muscle building phase, I'm not doing nearly as much cardio because it's not optimal, right? I'm trying to be either at maintenance or a surplus. But to re-answer that question, during my prep, I do use cardio as a tool, especially when my caloric budget is starting to lower and it's not going to be optimal for sustaining. I can't go under a certain number or else I'm going to go crazy. Yeah.
Yes. All right, so I'll wrap this up. So the role of cardio, again, I'm saying it's a pretty powerful stimulus for fat loss. It's a tool you can use, but it's not the only tool for fat loss. Again, we said earlier, a caloric deficit is probably the most powerful stimulus for fat loss. We didn't talk about supplements, but there's certain supplements that can be used as a tool. And I'm just going to say, if you're working with clients, get to know them, their resistance training schedule, their lifestyle, their preferences for cardio, and start working that into their fat loss phase if an additional stimulus is needed. All right, that is my thoughts on programming for muscle hypertrophy and an overview of the principles of using cardio for fat loss. I don't know if there's any other follow-up questions, or if Layne, if you want to take us to the next phase.
I think I'll take us to the next phase, and then we'll answer a few questions.
That's okay.
So, Maria, do you want to go ahead? Yep. So, the announcement you've all been waiting for. So, over the last 2 years, Bill and I have been working on putting together a certification that will encompass the gap in the market that we're talking about. So basically, yes, for in-person personal trainers, but truly we targeted this at online coaches. So we want to basically synergize nutritional and resistance and aerobic exercise recommendations. And so we developed what we've called the Physique Coaching Academy. Now, I think a lot of people see that and they think, oh, that must just be for competitors. This is for anybody who wants to lose fat or gain muscle or both. So if your clientele involves people who want to lose fat or gain muscle, if that's something that's interesting to them, this is going to be the course you want to take. If we look at the modules, we anticipate that this is probably a 6 to 12 month course for most people, unless you're just way smarter than Bill and I. So it is what we believe will become the standard against which all other courses for this are measured. So we basically are going to try and completely change the game. So Gabriel says it expands even more on your nutrition certification, Layne. Think about my 2 nutrition short courses as nothing more than an appetizer. This is the main course, okay? So it is a higher end product. It is more expensive, but you will learn. I feel very confident saying this. And Bill, if I'm wrong, because you actually teach college and graduate level courses, but you will learn more about how to change people's body composition in this course than you would by getting a graduate degree in either exercise science or nutritional science. I feel very confident in saying that. Bill, I don't know. You know me, I'm not big on making those sorts of crazy claims, but I gotta imagine you kind of feel the same way.
Yeah, I would make one caveat. Other than my program, because this is my research line, programs don't have courses in this. They don't have a course in body composition. Like you said, you can get a course in nutrition, you can get a course in strength and conditioning, but there's no interaction between how those things are synergistically related, like you're going to get with our accredited course.
Exactly. And if you coach physique athletes, if you coach people who get on stage, this is the course you need to have. We're not, if you've taken my short courses, it's very pragmatic. It's here's what matters, here's kind of a cursory overview of why it matters, and then here's how to do it. Okay? That's great. But if you don't have the underlying knowledge behind that, it's going to be really hard to expand outside that repertoire. This is going through, look, I'll be honest, Bill's section on aerobic exercise for fat loss was over 100 pages by itself in a Google Doc with no images or nothing. All right? That is insane. That is basically an ebook of probably 180 pages on its own if we were to do it like that. And for example, like I go through when it comes to macronutrients, it's like, okay, you know about protein, you know about carbs. How are these things digested? How are they assimilated? What is the metabolism of each? What is protein metabolism involved? When we talk about things like anabolism, what does that mean at a cellular level? And how is that affected by various stimuli? All of this is tied in together in a way that not only gives you the underlying information, it is also giving you pragmatic stuff that you can actually take and start coaching people with. Okay? So, what does it mean? So not only are you getting the coursework, you're getting a virtual mentoring program with Bill and myself. So, about a 6-month program. It integrates online modules, webinars, and coaching calls. So it's not just like, hey, here's the coursework, go have fun. We are walking with you on this journey, and we're only taking 250 students for the first year. So if you want to get in, you better be ready when the application comes out, because you'll want to click sign up right away, because I promise you, we are going to sell this out. Now, so basically, in summary, when you sign up for this, you'll get an initial onboarding call with our team, which will onboard you, make you feel comfortable. Then you'll get online course access, which is our 8 course modules, interactive with the latest research. A monthly group call, so group call with Bill and I, which also gets saved to the learning platform. So if you can't make it, you don't have to worry. You can replay everything. A monthly call with our team to recap the curriculum, align goals, and give you support. So if you have any questions or anything isn't clear, they can follow up with you on that. Daily support and interaction with the team in our community. And you get an exclusive coaches directory. So what we will start doing is we will have a directory of coaches who are PCA certified, because we believe at some point we are going to be recognized as the certification that you need to have. So you can go into your gym and verify, hey, I'm PCA certified. Like I went through Layne and Bill's certification. Here's my evidence, whatever. You can point to our webpage and show them. So we really feel like this is going to be an absolute game-changing course. And we don't just plan to sit here with this course. We plan to add way more to it. So it is going to be incredible. Like I said, Bill and I have literally been working on this for years. So don't miss out on your chance. So you can check your email right now, and you can register to pre-launch your interest in PCA. Like I said, we're only taking 250 students in a year. Those who get our methods will get pre-approved. So if you've already done my short courses or some of the other clean health courses, you'll get pre-approved. And, drum roll please, you'll get an exclusive offer with my courses I have right now, the level 1 and level 2 nutrition certifications, that you can get them for $478, and normally they're $797. So for the next 2 days, if you decide you want to sign up for one of those and prepare yourself for PCA, you can do that, and you're basically going to get them about half off.
I will chime in.
Steven says...
Oh, real quick to chime in, and I'll recap this at the end after the Q&A. If you guys are looking on how to redeem the special offer, you will be receiving an email after our masterclass is over with the way for you to get this exclusive offer. And again, it is 48 hours after this masterclass ends for you to redeem your 40% off. And of course, if you keep joining our masterclasses, we are here to provide you a big thank you perk. So make sure you are going to keep a lookout, because as Layne said, we do have masterclasses lined up, and we're going to keep going more and more in depth, providing lots of free education. And this only scratches the surface what PCA is going to bring to everybody.
Yeah. So somebody asked, can you briefly talk about the modules? I don't want to go into them too much, but essentially, like, one of the first modules is client assessments, how to read and analyze research, resistance exercise. Bill kind of went through. So what Bill just presented here on resistance exercise is about like 5% of what's actually in the course. Okay, so literally he just flew through this. So there's that. There's nutritional metabolism that's involved in it. There's energy. There's a section on energy balance. There's a section on the macronutrients. There's a section on advanced nutrition programming and then basic nutrition programming. All kinds of stuff. Supplementation section. We've got it all in there. Stephen says, do you anticipate CECs or CEUs? We anticipate way more than that. But yes. But the hope is that over time we will actually have this accredited. So we don't know when that's going to be, because that is a long process. But people who take it early, do not worry. We will come up with something to make sure that even if you have taken it when it's not accredited, that we can get you on board once it is. So let's see here. Go ahead, Maria.
One of the questions was, will there be any prerequisites in order to enter this course? So will they have to have other accreditations or courses that will need to be like pre-approved that they have to have had taken, or be a practicing PT in order to be able to enroll into this course?
Bill, did we ever make a final decision on that?
I don't think so. I think that the assumption is that you are knowledgeable on resistance training, knowledgeable on nutrition, but no actual standardized accredited prerequisites.
So I think what I will say is, remember, we only are taking 250 students. And so what is likely is, if we have more than 250, we will probably select the people that have done the courses as prerequisites through Clean Health, or who have those more advanced sort of credentials. So that being said, I would say that some of these courses can only help you, because some of this stuff, we write it as pragmatic as we can, but having more knowledge will definitely help you coming in, because I'm going to be honest, our tests are not going to be easy. Like, this is not just going to be a certification that you can walk in and anybody can get. We don't want everybody to be able to pass our test the first time. In fact, we want quite a few people to not pass the first time, because we want to make this a very highbrow certification that when people find out you have been certified by PCA, they go, oh, wow, this person actually knows what they're talking about. So, yeah, as Maria said, the expert in anything was once a beginner. Maria, can you take it back to the previous slide real quick, because I want to just go over that.
Yeah, of course.
Yep. So, the next steps, you can get a special offer to save over $300, 12 modules, 60 plus lessons, and this is my complete certification, and it is an unofficial prerequisite for PCA. So again, if you submit your information and you want to get in with PCA, if you've done these courses, you are going to be, I can't guarantee, but I can almost guarantee that you will be able to get in. So, okay. Now, with that being said, I think that's it for the promotional part, right, Maria?
Yeah, we are wrapping
so
up with that.
we can, I think, yeah, let's take like 10 minutes of questions, because I think it would
so
be
I'm going to
nice
stop
for us
sharing
get
the
some
screen,
questions
and then we're going to
from the
dive
audience.
into our Q&A. I have pulled a few questions from our students who registered, and then some that were in the chat now. I'm going to go into talking about cardio real quick, going back to that so both of you can chime in to answer. So one of the questions was in regards to splitting up cardio and that effectiveness. So for example, let's say you have a prescribed cardio of, let's say, 40 minutes. is there an effect of doing 20 before, 20 after training, or like 20 in the morning, 20 in the evening, or you have to keep that together?
Layne, I'll let you go from your experience, and I can chime in if I feel like I can add something.
So what I'll say is, if you look at the mechanistic data, there is some interference effect with muscle protein synthesis signaling in terms of doing cardio beforehand, but it's dependent on intensity and dose as well. So if you're talking about like 20 minutes of walking before you resistance train, I don't think that's going to do anything negative to resistance training performance or anabolism. If you're talking about doing like 20 minutes of like high intensity intervals, I think that's quite a different animal. So what I will say to people is, you got to think about this in terms of a hierarchy, right? So ideally, in an ideal world, you do your cardio on a completely separate day from your resistance training. If you can't do that, try to space it out by 6 hours at least. I would say resistance training in the morning, cardio in the afternoon, ideally. If you can't do that, then maybe do the cardio first thing in the morning, and then you can do the resistance training in the afternoon. If you can't do that, then what I would recommend is doing your resistance training first, since for most of us, the priority is our body composition, and resistance training is the most powerful tool to modify your body composition. Do resistance training first, then do your cardio afterwards, so that if you're doing 40, 50 minutes of cardio, it's not negatively impacting your resistance training performance. And so that's kind of the methodology I would kind of track down to layer those results. But in terms of doing before and after, like 20 minutes, if we're talking about low intensity, I think that's totally fine. I don't think you're getting an added benefit from that, but I don't think it's going to have a negative effect either.
And I'll just add, earlier I was pretty adamant that adding cardio to your resistance training program does not limit your ability to build muscle mass. The evidence is not as friendly if you're a power athlete or an advanced strength athlete. So if you are a power lifter, you want to exert some caution on doing high volumes of cardio. And if you're a power athlete, you want to be very, very cognizant of doing high volumes of aerobic activity.
Yeah, I think the other thing to keep in mind is, even though the meta-analyses and the studies Bill cited, for example, say, well, it doesn't seem like cardio has a negative effect. Keep in mind, we're talking about, like, the mean is probably looking at 30 to 60 minutes of cardio, right? And probably on a weekly dose, probably like, 200 minutes max. There are some people who far exceed that, right? So if we start getting up into 300-400 minutes, who knows, if we're talking about an hour or 2 hours a day, there very well could be an interference effect. The research just hasn't picked up yet. So keep in mind, our recommendations are based off of the research that currently exists. But if you push anything too far, usually the body pushes back.
Great with what you guys are talking about in terms of like the effectiveness of cardio, and we have three general types. We have your high intensity, moderate intensity, and low intensity steady state cardio. Is there a difference between the effectiveness of each, and when you would recommend prescribing one over the other when it comes to optimizing fat loss, especially for a physique athlete who's probably getting ready for a stage? Is there a benefit to one over the other, or is it just straight down to preference?
I'll take this first, Bill, and then I want to get your perspective. So I like to think of this like I tell people with politics. There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, okay? So there is no one form of cardio that's better. High-intensity cardio is great because you can get a lot of calories burned in a short period of time compared to long-form cardio. The downside is it may more negatively impact your recovery from resistance training. It tends to not be as enjoyable, although some people like it. And at least for me, when I knew I had to go out and do my HIIT sessions, like, I had so much anxiety around the HIIT session that, like, I'd end up delaying for like 15, 20 minutes or whatever, just because I was so nervous about doing it. Low intensity cardio. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm just saying, like, I start yawning whenever I see myself talk. It's weird. Low intensity cardio is something where it doesn't really negatively impact your recovery from resistance exercise. What's nice is you can do other things while you're doing it, right? Like you can listen to a podcast or whatever, read a book, but it takes a much longer period of time. right? So it's all about like, what are you weighing? What's most important to you? If you're a really busy person and you've only got, like you're like, all I can do is 20 minutes a day. That's all I got. Well, then you probably want to do high intensity, right? But if you're somebody who's like, I work from home and I can take short walks and I can do this and that, well, cool, then do that. But there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. But when you match these various forms, high intensity, moderate intensity, low intensity, when you match them for total
I will
work
just
done,
chime in real quick to
you
say,
see the
like,
same
as an
fat loss
athlete,
and
I
stuff.
have used all methods, and I really do think it comes down also to your athletes and what their biofeedback is and how they're responding. For example, when I was trickling down to my third prep of the year, my energy levels were just not there, and I attempted HIIT, but just wasn't able to fulfill that level of effort to execute HIIT properly. So we used the tool of LIST, although the duration was, double or if not longer. I still had to get that expenditure there, but it wasn't as taxing on my body. So I guess it touches back on what you said, Layne. It really comes down to your athlete, where they are on prep, and how they're responding to the, everything, to training, nutrition, and the existing cardio that they're at. And then, Bill, did you have anything to add to that?
I can't add any more value to what you guys just said.
When it comes to, real quick, talking about the effectiveness and like when you're prescribing, cardio to your athletes, how can you ensure that cardio is executed properly? For example, somebody that you are assigning 40 minutes, let's say walking on a treadmill, if it's not performed properly, that 40 minutes may not be as effective if you're not exerting that level of effort. How do you measure that, and how do you note that your athlete is actually doing that and executing it properly?
Layne, do you want to start with that, or would you rather I
You
do
take it, Bill.
So that's an intriguing question. If I'm going to have somebody run, I'm going to tell them, well, first of all, I'm going to find out their preferences. I'm a huge advocate of adherence and trying to, as much as possible, enjoy the process. Now, I am not a coach. Layne is an expert coach. Maria, you're the high level competitor. But I'm gonna prescribe walking on the treadmill or walking outdoors. If I'm working with a client, I'm trusting that they're doing. I have to have trust with my client. If I'm going to prescribe that they run, I would say at a level that you could have a conversation. And again, that would be more than a walk, but less than a run for X amount of time. Other than that, if I don't have that trust with a client, I'm lost on a lot of fronts.
Yeah, I would say another tool, and I've had this with me, and then Layne, you can take over to answer that, is have some scale of RPE, right? We can do that for training. We can do that for cardio as well. I've been guilty when I've been really tired and I've pushed cardio for the end of the day. My Stairmaster speed is way lower. If I have that prescribed, then I'm kind of half-assing it, right? And that really comes down to like how I'm going to be looking on my check-in. So I think one of the things that's helped me, and I've used this with my clients, is using like an RPE scale. Like you said, you said to walk in order to have a conversation. That is some way, shape, or form measuring that RPE, if I'm not mistaken, right? So have that sort of measure with your clients, whatever that may look like for you and your audience.
Yeah, so I think some really great points here. And actually, when it comes to like Bill said it, you have to trust that what they're doing, that they're going to actually do it. So, and again, this just points out how comprehensive PCA is. I actually spend a lot of time talking about the coach and client relationship and how to build that relationship and how to build that trust. This isn't just like a playbook of, well, tell them to eat this macros and then tell them to do this cardio and this lifting and then go coach. That is the smallest portion of being a coach. If it was just about that, you can find YouTube videos and books and all that stuff that will tell you what to do. At the end of the day, what you're trying to do is lead people. You are trying to manage people. You cannot lead people without the appropriate skills. And so quite a bit of the coursework focuses on the coach-client relationship. So I think you guys will be really mind blown by how comprehensive this is, and probably some things that I can promise you no course has ever taught you or even like brought up as a consideration in terms of this stuff. So I'm very excited.
Yeah, the art of coaching is something that no textbook can really teach either. Like there's a very huge difference, and there's a gap in our in our education, especially with on my end from what I've learned and taken up to so far. You can learn as much as you want to learn. You can take every course that's out there, read every book, but there's one thing to develop that coach and athlete relationship, so you're able to actually implement it and have them make those changes, which is one of the hardest things. And we did a survey on our student group, which I highly recommend you guys join. We have the Clean Health student group where if you're taking any courses, I highly recommend you join that, because we do answer questions and we interact. And one of the things that we did this week is take a poll on what is the biggest struggle that PTs and trainers faces, that level of adherence, compliance, and having the athlete actually put what we are prescribing to action. Or we can have all of that knowledge, but it's that barrier that we need to learn how to break as coaches. And that's when you make a breakthrough as a coach, because then you're going to bring results, and results are going to grow you as a coach as well. We had a question of how you can join the group. Just go on Facebook and then request it, and I'll let you in. I moderate that, and we can have conversations. You can talk to other coaches. And of course, with the PCA, we're going to have a group as well once that is kicked off the ground. Now, anything else to add to that, or we can jump to the next question?
Yeah, I think we'll do one last question. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things when you talked about failure, and in order to know you're shy of failure, you want to have a moment where you experience what failure is. As a coach, especially an online coach, if you're not there in person, that can be kind of hard to teach a client how to do so. What would you say is, like, for each of you, a top tip to help a client know when they reach that failure and how to do that safely? So which movements or something that you would recommend for them to apply it? Because like you said, some movements may not be optimal or safe to go to failure. So that would be our last question before we wrap it up.
Go ahead, Bill.
So I like the intimate concern for the client, because again, if you're going to use squats and use that as a test for failure, you're risking injury. It's not something I would recommend. Or if you're going to use it, make sure you have safety catches in place, all that stuff. But I would to teach the principle or the concept, standing dumbbell curls is perfect, because when you can't lift it anymore, you can just literally drop them to the floor. So that would be a very low risk way to teach the concept of training to failure. And the other thing that I would recommend, and I don't want to say that this is in our course because it's not, but there's nothing to stop you from getting video feedback of your client's training and giving feedback on that.
Yeah.
And I did mention this thing that I call test days. So once a month, you choose a weight and you just go until you can't lift it anymore. You go to failure or until your form breaks down. And that way, for the next few weeks or maybe even few months, you now have an objective and a determined failure number that you can base off future workouts.
Perfect. Yeah. I think that's like a skill that any athlete can, with training age, you start to learn how to push yourself there safely. And once you learn how to do it once, it's much easier to apply that to all movements. And sometimes you may benefit from having a training partner be there for safety, asking someone kindly to spot you if you need to. You want to push it to that next level. We're all in the gym to better ourselves for the most part, right? So don't be afraid to be asking for help, and be that person for someone else too, so that we can build that community of people that are really upskilling their training. For everybody that joined us, I'm going to wrap this masterclass up. Big thank you for everybody joining us live. Some points to touch on. Of course, you have our exclusive offer that is going to be emailed to you, plus the ability to enter our pre-sale list for PCA. So make sure you keep a lookout in your emails for that after this masterclass is over. Of course, please join our current Clean Health student group on Facebook in order to be in the know for the latest announcement, interact with students, interact with other educators. If you guys want to watch this replay or have that, all our masterclasses are going to be posted to our YouTube channel. So make sure you are subscribing, because not only are these masterclasses going on there, but we have endless amounts of free education. And you'll see familiar faces. Bill and Layne are on our YouTube channel. They've curated amazing amounts of free education. Follow us on social media. And of course, biggest thank you to everybody joining us. We love sharing that knowledge with you and can't wait to I think, we're going to change the game in the industry, and I cannot wait to see that shift and be here at the part of the beginning of that. But Bill, Layne, thank you guys so much for doing what you do. You guys are changing the game for real, and I'm very grateful to be here at the start.
Get ready to flex.
Oh, also, Layne, good luck at Worlds.
Oh, thank you. Very excited, very excited. Nice seeing you, Maria. See you, Bill.
Nice seeing you guys. We'll keep in touch and make sure you guys keep a lookout for our next announcement to our masterclass. But till next time.